to protect the most vulnerable among us. So, ladies and gentlemen, I urge members to oppose this incredibly dangerous amendment, and I continue to reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from West Virginia.
Again, Madam Chairman, I just respectfully disagree with the comments made, recognizing again that this House has already spoken on this matter of reducing it from 100 to 50. And the real issue here is whether or not we want to have 98% of the rules that are being promulgated to go without oversight and review. It's time that we get this under control and allow more of our people to get back to work. So again, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Maryland.
I will. I'm going to yield back, but again, Madam Chair, I hope that the body will vote against this amendment.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from West Virginia.
Madam Chairman, I just encourage my colleagues to support this amendment, and once it's adopted, to support the piece of legislation that's so needed. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from West Virginia. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from West Virginia will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 14, printed in Part B of House Report 112-616. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
Madam Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 14, printed in Part B of House Report number 112-616, offered by Mr. Schweikert of Arizona.
Pursuant to House Resolution 738, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. My amendment hopefully is deemed to be somewhat simple. As this piece of legislation moves forward, trying to make sure that the definition of cost from the regulatory environment is properly, shall we say, a proper box is built for it. So the amendment is in many ways, it's very simple, is the costs to organizations, a business, business concern, as rules are being promulgated, that business is spending money to get into compliance. Those costs should also be calculated and put into the cost to the economy calculation. Secondly, as the calculations are being built, it should also, the calculations should take a look at what it did to the revenues of organizations, because those revenues are what are used to hire people, to grow, to expand the economy, and actually ultimately expand the tax base. So the amendment's very simple. It basically says, as the calculations are being made for costs of regulations, okay, let's actually add them up in a fashion where we actually acquire the real costs. And with that, Madam Chairman, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Purpose is the gentleman from Maryland.
Claim time in opposition, Madam Chair.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I yield myself such time as I may consume. I strongly oppose the amendment offered by the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert, which would make an already ambiguous bill even harder to implement. The amendment proposes to define the term annual cost to the economy as including any expected change in revenue of businesses caused by such regulation, including any change in revenue as a result of preparing for the implementation of the regulation. Imagine the consequences of this amendment. If it would cost a business any additional funds to ensure that baby formula does not contain toxic substances, that business could block a regulation requiring those safety measures. Is that really how we want to run our country? The truth is that businesses routinely blame regulations for costs they already incur. For example, power companies routinely blame the EPA for the fact that high-cost coal plants struggle to compete in today's market with lower-cost natural gas plants, despite the fact that many of these coal plants are shut down because they are uncompetitive. Some repeatedly blame EPA regulations for forcing their closings. The intention of this amendment appears to be to give businesses a veto over any regulation they oppose just by claiming that its implementation somehow affects their bottom line. Since it would be virtually impossible for OMB to confirm or deny such claims, they would be irrefutable. Now, I do believe that the cost of regulations imposed on industry should be one of many factors considered when we compare the overall costs and benefits of a rule. But these costs should not be the overriding factor to be considered, as this amendment would require. The amendment is just another example of the misguided effort to put businesses' profits before the health and safety of the American people. Therefore, I urge members to oppose this unworkable and harmful amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Arizona.
Reclaiming my time, Madam Chairman. And I appreciate the gentleman from Maryland's comments, but you know, he hit one part there, and that is you do believe that the costs to industry, to business, to job creators should be calculated. It's just the debate here is how they should be weighted and how ultimately, I assume, how they should be documented. All I'm trying to accomplish here with this amendment is a couple very simple mechanics, is those costs that go into the preparatory to be in compliance with the newly promulgated rule should be calculated, and that the calculations that of the cost in the net revenues, gross revenues, to a job-creating industry should also be part of that calculation. And part of this was, the bill is, I obviously fully support, but I thought actually creating a little tighter definition of many of the types of costs that happen in a regulatory environment. I mean, obviously we will have a separation on the view of, does it stymie regulation, does it help I'm from the view that I truly believe one of the great hindrances to economic growth, to job growth in this country, is the substantial growth of our regulatory environment. Okay, if we're going to run legislation, it says regulations that exceed a certain cost, you know, are held till employment and others, you know, reach a certain level. Why not make sure we're calculating those appropriately? And, Madam Chairman, with that, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Maryland.
Madam Chair, I stand on my arguments, and I would yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
And, Madam Chairman, with that, I will yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Arizona. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Pursuant to Clause 6 of now in order to consider Amendment Number 15, printed in Part B of House Report 112-616. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
To offer an amendment.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 15, printed in Part B of House Report number 112-616, offered by Mr. George Miller of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 738, the gentleman from California, Mr. Miller, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, my amendment would allow the Occupational Health and Safety Administration to continue efforts to prevent combustible dust and fire explosions in the workplace. Combustible dust explosions threaten lives, limbs, jobs, and property across this country. And it's abundantly clear that the federal regulatory action is needed, but the bill before us today threatens to block that action. Beginning in 2003, the Chemical Safety Board investigated 3 major explosions caused by combustible dust in North Carolina, Kentucky, and Indiana, where 14 workers lost their lives. As part of this investigation, the board identified hundreds of other combustible dust fires and explosions causing at least 119 fatalities and 718 injuries over 15 years. The board recommended that OSHA issue rules to protect against these hazards because the existing OSHA protections were inadequate. The investigators were not alone. Family members have also asked that action be taken. Tammy Miser of Kentucky testified before Congress how her brother Sean Boone was killed in a metal dust fire in an aluminum wheel plant in Huntington, Indiana in 2003. She told us how Sean suffered from this horrific event. She said that Sean did not die instantly. He lay on the floor, He laid on the smoldering floor after the explosion while aluminum dust burned through his flesh and muscle tissue. His breath burned his internal organs as the blast took his eyesight. Sean was still conscious and asking for help when the ambulance took him. He lived for a number of hours before he finally succumbed to his energies. Sean wasn't the first to die at work this way, and he hasn't been the last. In more than 4 years since the Imperial Sugar explosion in Georgia, that explosion killed 13 workers. It caused hundreds of millions of dollars in damage. The tragedy was the result of unchecked accumulation of sugar dust that ignited and caused a chain of explosions, and Port Wentworth Sugar Refinery was leveled. These workplace explosions have not stopped. There have been 23 major combustible dust fires or explosions that have killed 15 and injured 35 since that Imperial Sugar explosion in Georgia. The response of OSHA has been to begin the development of a rule to reduce the risk of combustible dust explosion. That rule should be allowed to go forward, and this bill threatens the opportunity of that bill to go forward, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman, for what purpose does the gentleman from Oklahoma rise?
I rise in opposition to the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Well, I can certainly empathize and have tremendous compassion for the families that are involved and the individuals that are involved in this. OSHA has had this rule and has started working through this rule since 2009 and been in the advanced rulemaking phase for a very long time. And the struggle they have is this large one-size-fits-all approach. OSHA has some great options, even under the passage of this particular bill. Option number 1 for them, narrow their rulemaking. They're doing a large one-size-fits-all to try to cover all types of dust, all types of factories, all types of places. If they were to narrow their rule to specific types of places, they would be well under the $100 million limit. The second rule they have is very clear. This bill itself already sets in an exemption for health and safety. Clearly, this would be within that guidelines of health and safety. The President could do an executive order and pass that and then allow them to move forward, or you could come back to Congress. Now, the thought that only the folks at OSHA are compassionate about issues like this fails even the most modest of tests. Obviously, people that are within Congress are also compassionate to the needs here. So if a regulation comes that deals with a problem in a common-sense manner that can function, certainly Congress would be able to prove that. Certainly a president's going to have tremendous compassion for the health and safety of individuals if they're able to come up with a regulation that clearly deals with this. So while I have tremendous compassion for these families and look forward to OSHA completing what they have been stalling on for 3 years, this bill already deals with this, and this exception is not needed in addition to this. So with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from California.
So these workers who work in these dangerous conditions around all kinds of dust that explodes on a moment's notice, without any notice, in fact, they should rely on the idea that we would all be compassionate here. The subcommittee that reported this legislation asked people in the industry, and they immediately targeted this standard. This won't be about the compassion of members of Congress. This will be about the interests and the lobbying by the special interest to keep this dust standard from going into effect. It will not meet the requirement of imminent danger because it happens all the time. We have about 18 of these a year. It happens all the time, and people are killed all of the time, and in different settings with different dust. This isn't about one size fits all. This is about dust that explodes and kills people and burns them to death on the job. destroys the workplace. In some cases, it's never rebuilt. The jobs are never brought back. And in other cases, as in one of these cases, the employer is now saying, give us this dust standard. Give us this dust standard. The workers in this country have a right to rely on the law to protect them, not some notion of this committee or this Congress's sense of passion and whether it will be invoked on that given day or not against the lobbying efforts by these industries. It's about the law that protects workers and their families. Workers who get up and go to work every day, and their families and themselves hope that they get to come home at night. But it doesn't happen for a lot of workers. And in these industries with combustible dust, it happens over and over and over again. They get killed on the job. I've been here a long time working on combustible dust, and let me tell you, the industry doesn't say, oh, gee, we've killed enough people, let's all just kind of hold hands and see if we can come up with something. It's complicated. You must do it right. It's based upon science. It's based upon research so that you can isolate the dust, so you can isolate so the explosions don't happen. But this legislation, suggested by the committee, notices in the committee that this is one of the regulations that they would target. They can use the old conundrum, one size fits all. You know, whether you're working around combustible dust, you want the dust that you have taken care of. So maybe we can whittle it down. We'll take care of some of the dust, but not all of the dust, because we can get under the $100 million rule. What are you talking about? These are the lives of the American people. These are lives of working people. This is an interesting notion you have. It just doesn't fit in the workplace. It just doesn't fit in the daily lives of these people who are threatened by these horrible, horrible, horrific incidents that take place, usually through no fault of the worker. Other decisions were made about not keeping the plant clean. Other decisions were made about not installing equipment that could mitigate this under the old standards. And that's the reason why we need the law. The workers in this country need the law. Not some expression of compassion late at night in an empty chamber of Congress.
Gentleman's time
Tell them
has
to rely
expired.
on that. That one night in an empty chamber of Congress, the proponents of the legislation says, we'll be compassionate when this comes to the floor. We'll understand
Gentleman's
this.
time has
We'll grant you a
expired.
waiver. We'll figure it out. We'll honor an executive order. BS.
Gentleman's time has expired.
How
Gentleman from
unfortunate.
Oklahoma.
How unfortunate to have the implication that members of Congress, including myself, that have workers in my district that live with this same thing, that we would not have compassion for people in our district.
Gentleman's out of order. Gentleman from Oklahoma.
OSHA has not completed this regulation. They have delayed this. They've had multiple options. They need to complete their work. There is a work safety issue that's here. But the bill as it currently stands up strong for worker safety and allows any exception for worker safety currently in this bill. So while exceptions are pursued to add additional things into this bill, the bill itself already contains those things. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The question? The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
I asked for yeas and nays.
The gentleman asked for a recorded vote.
Yes.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 16, printed in Part B of House Report 112-616. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I rise today to offer an amendment to Titles 1 and 2 of H.R. 4078. My amendment would exempt a proposed...
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. My amendment would exempt a
The
proposed...
gentlewoman will suspend for a moment, please. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 16, printed in Part B of House Report number 112-616, offered by Ms. Woolsey of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 738, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Woolsey, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California.
Madam Speaker, my amendment would exempt a proposed worker safety rule from the regulatory freeze and the prohibition on so-called midnight rules. This OSHA rule would update 40-year-old protections for those working around high-voltage transmissions and distribution lines and equipment, bringing them into the 21st century. If this amendment is not adopted, Madam Speaker, many workers will be needlessly executed or burned from electrical hazards, at least until unemployment drops to 6%. Are we really going to make workers wait until the jobless rate is 6% before getting protections against burns from high-voltage electric arcs that run as hot as 35,000 degrees? Well, if we are, they'll be waiting a long time because this Republican majority shows absolutely no interest in passing a jobs bill. Is it fair, Madam Speaker, to make these workers wait for 6% unemployment before their employers have to assess and provide safe minimum distances from high-voltage lines? Is it morally defensible to make workers wait for a full economic recovery before they get simple protections like rubber-insulated sleeves so their arms aren't blown apart by contact with high-voltage wires? Certainly not. Unless the bill sponsor is aware of some new scientific discovery, 35,000 degrees feels just as hot no matter how many Americans are out of work. Shock at 14,000 volts of electricity do the same damage whether unemployment is 8% or 6%. Yet this bill seems to assume lethal hazards are somehow less lethal during tougher economic times. Or even worse, this bill implies that preventable electrocutions are somehow acceptable whenever unemployment is high. This is irresponsible, if not unethical. With that, I reserve the remainder of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oklahoma rise?
Opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I thank my colleague for bringing this up. But this, again, is something that's obviously dealt with already in the text of the bill. As we anticipated, there would be issues like this. On page 3, line 23 of the bill, it actually states the President has the ability by executive order dealing with any significant regulatory action to go ahead and waive this if it's necessary because of an imminent threat to health or safety or other emergency. This is already dealt with in the bill itself. And while we do need to be able to deal with this, and obviously the vast majority of electricity providers are very attentive to their workers, including the companies that are in my district that take great pride in how they care for the health and safety of the workers that are on those lines and that are out there in very dangerous situations. It's a very important thing to them. We have the ability already within this bill to be able to address that. So for that reason, I would oppose this. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from California.
Madam Speaker, each year 74 electrical workers covered under this rule are killed on the job. Another 444 are severely injured. OSHA is authorized to regulate a hazard when the risk of fatality is more than 1 in 1,000. The fatality rate for workers covered under this OSHA rule is 14 times that level. Full compliance would eliminate 79% of these fatalities and injuries. Madam Speaker, the one-size-fits-all approach of this bill will block a common-sense, cost-effective rule that produces an estimated $4 in benefits for every dollar in costs. OSHA's proposed update would provide an estimated $100 million in savings every single year. While the authors of this bill argue that the President can seek a waiver from Congress to allow the rule, I'm not buying it. As we saw with the so-called comma bill proposed by Mr. Sensenbrenner a number of years ago, it took 3 sessions of Congress just to fix a harmless typo. We all know that when a special interest wants to stop something around here, there are countless ways to win. If this bill is not amended, Madam Speaker, Congress will be sentencing scores of workers every year to preventable electrocutions and to burns. I ask for adoption of this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Oklahoma.
One quick statement on it. Thank you. This particular rule is unique in a lot of our conversation because it's already gone through the process. Currently, the OIRA office already has it. In fact, they have had it for the last 30 days. They could issue this at any point. So this is right at that point that it's going to be released. It wouldn't even fall underneath this law. Obviously, we passed this bill tonight. We send it over to the Senate. It works through the process. OIRA can release this at any point that they choose to. So while, again, I have tremendous compassion for the workers that are on the lines, and I have tremendous respect for electric companies around the country and how they take care of their workers, this particular rule has already gone through the process, already sits in OIRA, and it would not apply to them. With that and also the knowledge that we have the exception rate built in for safety, I would choose to oppose this and continue to do that. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlewoman from California.
Well, Madam Speaker, the gentleman from the other side of the aisle is not correct on this. If this rule were adopted, then the President signing the bill would be moot. It would not. All right, just the opposite. If the President signed the bill, the regulation would stop it. So in that, Madam Speaker, in closing, the adoption of my amendment will save lives. The lives of Americans who work in some of the most dangerous conditions imaginable. It is ridiculous and it's downright cruel to tell these men and women who risk electrocution every day that OSHA will only step in to help them when the jobless rate reaches some arbitrary level, whether unemployment is 6 or 8 or 10%, whether the economy is strong or weak. We need to protect our workers. I ask for members to support my amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from California. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Speaker?
The amendment is not agreed to.
Madam Speaker,
Gentlewoman is recognized.
I ask for a recorded vote.
It is, forgive me, yes, with apologies. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from California will be postponed.
Thank you.
It is now in order to consider amendment number 17, printed in Part B of House Report 112-616. It is now in order to consider amendment number 18, printed in Part B of House Report 112-616. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk that's made in order under the rule.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 18, printed in Part B of House Report number 112-616, offered by Ms. Waters of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 738, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Waters, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California.
Thank you very much. Earlier today, during the vote for H.R. 459, the Federal Reserve Transparency Act, I voted yes for this legislation. This was not my intent. I intended to vote no. I strongly believe that the Federal Reserve should remain an independent central bank that is free from political influence. Therefore, I would like the record to reflect that my vote in favor of this legislation was an error and that I would have voted against it, and I thank you. And now on my amendment. My amendment authorizes such appropriations as may be necessary to allow our financial regulators to carry out the activities required under Titles 6 and 7 of this legislation. The purpose of the amendment is that if we're having our regulators undertake new and perhaps even duplicative economic analysis functions, we should provide them with the resources to do so. Mr. Chairman, we know that the majority has tried to shortchange our federal regulators in terms of appropriations, particularly when we contrast their funding with the new responsibilities entrusted to them after the financial crisis. Let's consider the SEC, one of the cops of on the beat for Wall Street. This agency is tasked with enforcing our securities laws. They protect investors and make sure firms are held to account when they create toxic financial instruments. The fiscal year 2013 Republican budget proposal calls for funding the SEC at almost $200 million less than what the President has requested and what the Senate Appropriations Committee has provided in their funding bill. This is just another part of an onslaught of cuts to the SEC's budget that Republicans have proposed and that we have been fighting against over the last few years. The SEC's funding has been erratic. After significant increases in the early half of the decade, the agency was forced to reduce staff. During this period of inconsistent funding, trading volume more than doubled. Since 2003, the number of investment advisors has grown by roughly 50%, and funds that they manage have increased nearly 55%. The SEC's 3,800 employees currently oversee approximately 35,000 entities, including thousands of investment advisors, mutual funds, broker-dealers, and public companies. With all of this responsibility, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to spread the Commission even thinner with new duplicative cost-benefit requirements that open the agency up to constant litigation. And they want to do this while at the same time refusing to devote additional resources to the agency. The result is that the SEC would be forced to divert resources away from other key functions of the Commission, including perhaps prosecuting wrongdoers who violate our securities laws. Madam Chair, I will reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona rise?
Madam Chairman, I rise in opposition to the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And to my friend from California, she's always been passionate and very articulate in the battle for resources for the regulators. But I'm going to stand here in opposition to this amendment for a couple very simple reasons. One, this is already the job they're supposed to be doing with the money they have, is this cost-benefit analysis. And we can talk about that further. But also, as you work through the amendment, I have great concern of the law of unintended consequences. And that is, in a weird way, subsidizing and incentivizing bad cost-benefit analysis. In the amendment, it basically says if you end up in litigation over your cost-benefit analysis, there should be an appropriation, unspecified amount of money, that the appropriator should send you for that litigation. So if you do a really bad job in your cost-benefit analysis and you get sued, you actually get more money that's supposed to be appropriated to you. So it's that sort of constant thing I focus on a lot, is that law of unintended consequences of, does it actually create an incentive that to draw down more cash for the agency for the litigation? The way you get to the litigation is the quality of the work that was done in the cost-benefit analysis. So there's two primary issues. A, this is what the agencies are supposed to be doing. And B, in the design of the amendment, I actually have a concern that ultimately it may incentivize the very thing we're trying to stop. And with that, Madam Chairwoman, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from California.
Madam Chair, my amendment also addresses Title VII of the bill, which relates to the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. The CFTC is the cop on the beat that we asked to regulate much of the derivatives market under the Wall Street Reform Act, and the CFTC is the agency that cracked down on Barclays when they manipulated a key interest rate benchmark, the LIBOR, in order to benefit their derivatives trades. This bill also imposes new cost-benefit requirements on the CFTC. While the requirements on this agency aren't as onerous as the ones imposed on the SEC, I think it is inappropriate to spread the CFTC any thinner when Republicans have proposed to cut the CFTC's funding by 12% relative to last year and 40% relative to what the Senate provided. As CFTC Chairman Gary Gensler said last month, the result of proposed funding, House funding cuts is to effectively put the interests of Wall Street ahead of those of the American public by significantly underfunding the agency. Congress tasked to oversee derivatives, the same complex financial instruments that helped contribute to the most significant economic downturn since the Great Depression. Finally, I disagree with the claim that more cost-benefit analysis can solve every regulatory question we face. In fact, I think that these economic analyses often offer a false sense of precision and fail to capture things that aren't easily quantifiable, things like avoiding the next financial crisis and protecting overall market integrity. I would urge my colleagues to support my amendment, which makes compliance with the new requirements under the underlying bill contingent on them receiving sufficient appropriations to carry out these functions. I would reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. My two arguments still stand, but there is one other point, and I actually have a little bit of information here. According to the Inspector General of the CFTC, the Commission regularly employs a stripped-down type of cost-benefit analysis, and this is proven perilous, and this is the actual quote, provides perilous for the financial market regulators. So in the past, they've used a stripped-down methodology. So in many ways, what we're doing here in the overall legislation is saying, here's the box you're supposed to be doing this. It's already part of your budget. And as I spoke earlier, in the design of the amendment, I have the fear of the unintended consequences that you're almost incentivizing that when the litigation happens, the agency actually ends up getting more money. And with that, Madam Chairwoman, I close.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlewoman from California.
In closing, this bill adds duplicative new rules. SEC is already held to account on cost-benefit analysis. Proxy access was overturned. The bill opens CFTC up to new industry lawsuits. I would ask for an aye vote on my amendment. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from California. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
A call for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from California will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 19, printed in Part B of House Report 112-616. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 19, printed in Part B of House Report number 112-616, offered by Mr. Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania.
Pursuant to House Resolution 738, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Fitzpatrick, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The amendment I'm offering tonight would require the SEC, when reviewing regulations, to consider the burden of applying Section 404B of Sarbanes-Oxley to companies with a public float of less than $250 million. Simply put, this amendment requires regulators to consider the cost of a specific regulation which hinders job creation in my district and across the nation. Section 404B requires audits of a public company's internal controls. While this sounds innocuous, the costs of external controls can be staggering. Those costs are exponentially more burdensome on smaller companies. Currently, the law extends the auditing requirement to any company with a public float of $75 million or more, and that number has been widely criticized as too low and adds an extremely costly burden on small and growing companies. Recognizing that burden on emerging growth companies, the House overwhelmingly passed, as part of the Jobs Act, an exemption from 404B for companies with up to $1 billion in revenue for 5 years after their initial public offering. This amendment would merely require the SEC to consider the burden of Section 404B when reviewing their regulations and would not change current law. This amendment would apply to all companies and would not discriminate based on when a company issued their IPO. Congress and the SEC have appropriately recognized that all companies are not the same and smaller companies should be exempt from certain regulations. This amendment asks that the SEC consider these costs on smaller companies. If companies are priced out of being able to go public, it restricts capital formation and job creation. For those companies who still choose to go public, resources that could otherwise be used to hire and grow are being sucked away by unproductive compliance costs. Madam Chair, Synergy Pharmaceuticals is a New York-based company that does their entire R&D in Doylestown Borough in my district. They have 10 employees in their Doylestown research facility and 10 employees in New York. These are good-paying jobs by most definitions, but this is a small company. In fact, their market capitalization exceeds even the increased threshold of $250 million that this bill references, which is why some have advocated exempting companies with a public float as high as $500 million or $1 billion. But I reached out to their chief scientific officer and their chief financial officer to discuss this issue with them, and their comments were very instructive. I heard that 404B was one of the most significant regulatory burdens they face. In their words, it hurts. And it was not the direct costs of the audits or the person they had to hire internally to deal with these requirements, but the time that was spent and the efforts that were wasted. According to them, hours and even days' worth of time was spent finding ways to document and justify their procedures for something as menial as where the checkbook is kept. What would they do with the extra money if they didn't have to spend it on compliance? The answer I got was that there was no question it would go directly into research and development. I asked my colleagues, where is this money more productively used? In documenting how the checkbook is stored at night, or hiring research assistants in communities like Doylestown and in New York? Madam Chairman, entrepreneurial companies like Synergy are those we are counting on to create wealth and jobs and to restore America's vibrant economy. Their story is not unique, particularly in industries like biotechnology. This Congress recognized the importance of decreasing the regulatory burden on small and emerging companies in a strong bipartisan manner just a few months ago with the Jobs Act. This amendment is an extension of that effort, and I encourage my colleagues to support it. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts rise?
I rise in opposition.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I yield myself 3 minutes. This is an effort to exempt companies under $250 million. Now, the Jobs Act, which was recently passed with broad support, said that a startup company for its first 5 years would be exempt from this. This now would do away with that 5-year restriction without having had the kind of committee consideration it seems to me you ought to have. It does it in this way. And I differ with my colleague from Pennsylvania when he says it doesn't change the law. If it didn't change the law, they wouldn't offer it. He's not up here at 9 o'clock at night just to get exercise. It changes the law in a very significant way and sets a very bad precedent. The underlying legislation to which this would be an amendment requires a cost-benefit analysis. This cooks the books. This is not content to let it be an unbiased cost-benefit analysis, but it says it instructs the SEC to take into account the heavy burdens that, let me get the exact words, the large burden of such regulation. In other words, it's an effort to tip the scales of the very cost-benefit analysis. And we know that, by the way, as to intent, because the original version of this amendment was just a straight exemption of $250. But for parliamentary reasons, because that's not this committee's jurisdiction, it had to be redone. So the gentleman really wanted to just exempt everybody under $250 from Sarbanes-Oxley forever, as opposed to a 5-year exemption for a startup. But he had to amend it, so he amended it. And he amended it, as I said, in a way that unfortunately impugns the integrity of the cost-benefit analysis, because it puts a thumb on the scales. It says, oh, the cost-benefit analysis here should take into account the large burden. Well, it's already supposed to do it. Adding this is an instruction to the SEC, essentially, to find that they should be exempt. We have had a rash of Chinese companies buying small American companies and converting them, and people investing in them and getting taken. And the problem is that the Chinese accounting is very opaque. What this bill would do would be to prevent the United States authorities from applying Sarbanes-Oxley to protect those investors. I don't doubt that there's a very good company. I agree there's a very good company in his district, although he says it's above the limit. But you can't legislate for just the one good company. This is part of this nostalgia for a time when we had no regulation. Sarbanes-Oxley has improved the integrity of our capital markets. It has improved the confidence of investors. We did invest small startups. We exempted small startups, so for the first 5 years as a startup, up to $250 million, they don't have to do this. This says, in effect, by instructing the SEC to find that the cost outweighs the benefit no matter what, this gives a permanent exemption de facto for companies up to $250, which would include people who might be scamming in the case of the Chinese companies. And, as I said, it sets the bad precedent. If we're going to have cost-benefit analysis, and I think that can be overdone, let's have it in an honest and open way. Let's not put the thumb in the scales, as this does, by instructing the SEC, in effect, to find that the cost always outweighs it. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time, and gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Madam Chair, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Fincher.
Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. I rise in strong support of Mr. Fitzpatrick's amendment. Mr. Chairman, unemployed Americans are crying out for more jobs, urging Congress to review rules and regulations that stifle innovation, economic growth, and job creation. Overly burdensome regulations are hurting business expansion, which is why we are debating this bill this evening. Overly burdensome regulations is also why I introduced H.R. 3213, the Small Company Job Growth and Regulatory Relief Act, to expand the Sarbanes-Oxley 404B exemptions for companies with a public float of less than $350 million. Supporters of increasing the current $75 million exemptions from Sarbanes-Oxley 404B for small companies would save duplicative audit costs which hinder many companies from going public. Going public provides opportunities for companies to raise needed capital in order to expand, reinvest, and create jobs. Providing a permanent exemptions for Sarbanes-Oxley for companies with a public float of $250 million or less just makes good sense. I strongly encourage my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Pennsylvania. Gentleman's time has also expired. Gentleman from Massachusetts has 2 minutes remaining.
I guess I'm in a position of being disagreeable to some of my friends on the committee. The gentleman from Tennessee cited the company about to go public, but they're already exempted. The jobs bill that we passed and was signed into law exempts startups for the first 5 years until they go public. So this has no relevance to the startups. It has relevance to companies that have been in existence for more than 5 years as public companies. Again, we have got an exemption already for the first 5 years. And it says, in effect, don't give us this unbiased cost-benefit analysis. We'll tell you what cost-benefit analysis does. By the way, as to IPOs, when we are in the House under general leave, I will insert into the record an article by Mr. Davidoff in the New York Times talking about the advantages we have in IPOs these days, how the soccer team from England came here to do an IPO because our corporate governance laws are more favorable to them in allowing different classes of stock. I am sorry to see this continuing repudiation of the legacy of George W. Bush. I know he's not going to come to the convention, but gee, everything's being torn down. George Bush signed Sarbanes-Oxley. Oxley, by the way, is Mike Oxley, my predecessor as chairman of our committee. George Bush was very proud of Sarbanes-Oxley. It's an accounting requirement. And what this does is to make another chunk out of that regulation. Now, maybe we hear different people. My friends say the American people are crying out for an end to regulation. Every indication I have of public opinion is that people are tired of irresponsibility by a few, not everybody, but they are tired of people being scammed. And in fact, the notion that what we need in the financial area is less regulation is an odd one. It comes from people, I guess, who just slept through the last few years, didn't see the crisis we had because of this. Sarbanes-Oxley, of course, itself came about after Enron. So I would align myself with President Bush. I think he got this one right. I think Mike Oxley got this one right. Yes, for startups, for people about to go public, they have a $250 million exemption that I voted for, but a $250 million exemption. But to give a permanent exemption to companies at 250 and above is a mistake. And don't please start monkeying with cost-benefit analysis.
Gentleman's time has expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Pennsylvania. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Pennsylvania will be postponed. It is now in order to consider amendment number 20, printed in Part B of House Report 112-616. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have an amendment at the desk. It's number 20.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 20, printed in Part B of House Report number 112-616, offered by Mr. Posey of Florida.
Pursuant to House Resolution 738, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, my amendment stops the Securities and Exchange Commission from pursuing an agenda on climate change and keeps its focus instead on its core mission of protecting investors. In recent years, we've seen the Madoff and Stanford Ponzi schemes built people out of over $70 billion. Many of these victims live in our districts. They are shocked and are outraged that such a travesty could happen. One would think that after such embarrassments, the SEC would do whatever it could to focus its finite resources on stopping the next Ponzi scheme. At the very minimum, it would make sense for the SEC to appear to get serious in safeguarding the public from fraud and corruption. However, in 2010, early in 2010, the SEC issued an interpretive guidance for companies to disclose the impact of global climate change might have on their businesses. The SEC published this controversial guidance over the objections of dissenting commissioners. This was done without direction from Congress and outside the traditional rulemaking process. There are no laws in the United States explicitly addressing climate change. The guidance is inappropriate considering the SEC has bigger priorities. I don't have to tell my colleagues that climate change is a controversial and an unresolved issue. From a securities perspective especially, climate change information on a disclosure is highly speculative and dubious at best. If allowed to proceed, it invites all kinds of compliance costs and confusion down the road, and guess who will ultimately pay all those costs? Our constituents, the American public. Importantly, my amendment does not stop companies from mentioning bona fide weather and environmental risk in disclosures. And if a company really wants to weigh in climate change for some reason, they're free to volunteer that information. It just keeps the SEC focused on what they're supposed to be doing, and that is protecting people, not forcing unrelated agendas down their throats. I urge my colleagues to support the amendment and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland rise?
Claim time in opposition.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I yield myself such time as I may consume. Madam Speaker, federal securities law requires financial disclosures by public companies for the benefit of shareholders and investors. The Securities Exchange Commission provides detailed guidance on how to interpret and comply with these disclosure requirements, which are intended to ensure that potential investors fully understand a security before they purchase it. The SEC recently provided guidance on existing rules that require companies to disclose the impact that business or legal developments related to climate change could have on a company's bottom line. We want investors to know about this. These disclosures help investors understand how climate change affects a company's operations and their potential investments in the company. This amendment seeks to prevent this guidance from taking place. It seeks to keep investors in the dark. Rules discussed in the SEC's guidance are clearly needed, and the SEC's guidance will help publicly traded companies understand how key areas of climate change, such as new legislation or international accords, could affect what they need to disclose to the public. This guidance is also intended to help companies explain how the physical impacts of climate change could affect their performance. In issuing this guidance, the SEC did not opine on the science of climate change. The guidance seeks to help companies assess the possibility that events related to climate change may materially affect their bottom lines and trigger public disclosure requirements. This guidance is prudent and serves to benefit both the investor and the company. Ironically, with this amendment, my friends on the other side of the aisle who proclaim the value of transparency are acting to hurt investors by denying them important information. This amendment would also harm Wall Street by preventing the SEC from issuing clear guidance to help publicly traded firms understand what they need to disclose on this topic to ensure full compliance with the law. It provides some certainty. And so I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Florida.
How much time do I have?
3 minutes.
Okay. Thank you. The gentleman's points about disclosure are on point. They simply don't apply to what this amendment does. It does not deny required disclosure of risk. Let me be clear. Thousands and thousands of American families were devastated by Madoff, by Stanford, MF Global, and the like. People lost their homes. People lost their cars. People lost their children's education funds. People lost their lifelong retirement savings. I could go on and on forever, but we have a limited amount of time. The job with the SEC is to protect those people. The job of the SEC is to protect honest people from dishonest corporations and persons. It's not to impose other agendas on the American public. It's not to talk about the environmental stewardship of corporations. If a corporation dealing with securities does not disclose a significant environmental risk, then they're going to be liable for that failure to disclose. But it's not the SEC's job to talk about their stewardship. SEC knew for a decade, a full 10 years, over 10 years, that Madoff was stealing from people, and they refused to take any action for over a decade, and over $70 billion evaporated. People's lives are devastated. People died. People died. There are dead people because of what Madoff did. And the SEC didn't lift a finger. They were too busy doing other things. Now here we intend to put SEC back on the job and focus on what they're supposed to do, protect honest people from dishonest people. I reserve the balance of my time, if any.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Maryland.
You know, when we had the SEC head before our committee, I made it very clear that I thought more could have been done, and I think it is with regard to Madoff, and I think it was extremely unfortunate that what happened. But again, that does not mean that we shouldn't provide clarity over all subjects which may affect investors, and that's what we're talking about here. I'm rely on my argument, but I'm going to also yield to my good friend, Mr. Frank from Massachusetts.
Yielding. The gentleman says the SEC wasn't on the Madoff thing for many years. That's true. And I have to say, while I supported the Bush administration on Sarbanes-Oxley, I am critical of their administration of the SEC. For almost all of that time, we had an SEC that was not inclined to enforce. And I do not think the current SEC, under a very good chairman, Mary Shapiro, with a much more vigorous approach, ought to be taxed for the failures that were ideologically driven by the previous SEC. So I don't think it is valid to say, well, because they didn't catch Madoff. The SEC, during the Bush administration, reflected an unfortunate philosophy of non-regulation, of ceding to the companies more autonomy than they should have. and it is not a good basis on which to legislate going forward. I thank the gentleman for yielding.
I'll continue to reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Florida.
How much time do I have left?
1 minute.
I've endured about all I care to, and I think a large percentage of the people in this chamber and a lot of the people in this country have endured about all the finger-pointing and blame that they can endure. I don't care who shot John. I don't care who was in charge of the SEC before. The point of this bill is to keep the SEC focused on protecting investors.
Will the gentleman yield?
I yield the balance of my time.
The gentleman says...
Gentleman yield.
Reserve the balance of my time. Excuse me, I don't yield it.
Gentleman reserves.
I yield. How much time do I have, Madam?
1 minute.
I reserve 30 seconds to the gentleman.
Well, first of all, a large percentage of the people in this room would be 2. But secondly, the fact is that the gentleman from Florida is the one who started pointing fingers. When I talked about who's in charge of the SEC, all of a sudden he's above any criticism. But he's the one who impugned the SEC. He's the one who said the SEC sat and did nothing under Madoff. So if you're going to accuse the agency, then it becomes relevant as to who was running it. I didn't raise the issue of who was to blame and who was at fault. I was simply responding to my committee colleague from Florida. I thank the gentleman.
Gibson. Reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Very poetic, but it's off point.